While he was saying this, a synagogue leader came and knelt before him and said, "My daughter has just died, but come and put your hand on her, and she will live." Jesus got up and went with him, and so did his disciples. Just then, a woman who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak. She said to herself, "If I can only touch his cloak, I will be healed." Jesus turned and saw her. "Take heart, daughter," he said. "Your faith has healed you." And the woman was healed at that moment. When Jesus entered the synagogue leader's house and saw the noisy crowd and people playing pipes, he said, "Go away. The girl is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. After the crowd had been put outside, he went in and took the girl by the hand, and she got up. News of this spread through all of that region. That is the reading of his word. The kids are dismissed for Sunday school. Last week, I got a new phone. I didn't want to get a new phone. I had gone to McDonald's and set my phone on the counter. And then, without thinking, I used the facilities, but I had not picked my phone up, so someone else did. So when I came back out, my phone was no longer there. I thought maybe that I had misremembered and I'd left it in my car, but I was pretty sure that I remembered setting it and thinking, don't leave it sitting there. And so it was my own fault and the fault of one dishonest person. But when my phone was lost, I realized pretty quickly, I was like, I'm not getting that back. They didn't just borrow it to make a call. I thought, I've got to get my phone shut off because my banking information's on there and all my contacts are all on there. So I reached for my phone and it wasn't there. And I thought, okay, of course not. So I'm going to have to drive to T-Mobile to get them to shut my phone off. I'm leaving one step out because it turns out once I ran home to use my son's phone and they won't let me shut my phone off from my other phone that's actually on my plan. But so then I'm driving at a reasonable pace to T-Mobile because I don't want my phone to be used for any purposes. And I realized Judy's out doing something. I need to let her know my phone's gone. So if I have a button I can push in my car that will dial my wife. So I pushed it, and it didn't work because it takes my phone to do that. So I get to T-Mobile, and I quickly tell them I needed to shut my phone off, and they're like, "Oh, yeah, we can shut your phone off." And then they said, "Well, would you like a new phone?" And I said, "No, but I need a new phone." So they showed me the next, sitting over there under my chair, a Pixel 10. I had a Pixel 7. And I asked how much it costs, and she told me, and I said, "I'll bet I can get that for less. Let me look on Amazon." I didn't have my phone. So I said, "Okay, let me see the phone," and she brings me the phone, and we sit down at the table, and we're talking about it. It's like, "Okay, yeah, I will get a new phone, and I'll buy yours, because I've got to have a phone." And then she said, "Would you like a case?" And I said, "I don't think I need a case. I think I could get one cheaper when I look it up on Amazon." I am so used to having a phone that I cannot, even though I am in the process of replacing a phone that have stolen, and it's front and center in my mind, but my habit is so ingrained that I just continue to reach for what I know is not there, which amazes me. I think of myself as adaptable and reasonably intelligent, and yet still, I don't remember how many times I've tried to count in my head, and I don't want this story to run too long, but the number of times where I went for or expected to use my phone that I knew I didn't have. It's really, really hard to change. It's hard to, even when we know we need to change. Even when in the process of making a change, it's hard to change. Because we're creatures of habit. So last week we talked about in Matthew chapter 9, they sewing a patch on a patch of unshrunk cloth onto a torn older cloth. No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch will pull away, right? And then neither do people pour new wine into old wineskins. If you didn't listen to that sermon, a pretty quick summary is saying that you need to change what you're doing to preserve what you have that's new. That new things don't go into old things well. They will both be ruined. And that's what this verse says, that not only the new, but the old will be when you try to combine them, and that we have to intentionally work on changing and replacing the old with the new. Now, how our author Matthew is illustrating this, and he's been illustrating it for a while, we don't know it, but so much of the first set of chapters of Matthew hinge around the wineskins and the idea of having to put new in to replace old things. And Matthew's been illustrating this with how Jesus has been illustrating it. When I say that Matthew's doing this, don't hear me saying that he's making it up. He's pointing out what Jesus is actively doing, is trying to reformat the disciples' thinking and experience so that they won't go back to old behaviors and old beliefs. So when Jesus sees Matthew sitting at a tax collector's booth, the disciples are thinking, we're going to walk on by that guy because he's betrayed our people over and over and over. He steals from us. He's dishonest. And instead, Jesus says to Matthew, come, follow me. A new wineskin for new wine. Even a tax collector can follow Jesus. And the Pharisees are stumped by this. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked the disciples, why does your teacher go and have dinner with tax collectors and sinners? Because there's a new wineskin. There's no more exclusion because of race or faith or job or nationality. There's a new wineskin that Jesus has brought in, and they've got to change how they're thinking. So when Matthew is putting this in, why is Matthew including these things? If you read Mark and Luke, things are different. The stories are different. Some the same, some are different. John, very different. But Matthew's intentionally trying to draw our attention to this idea of everything must change. The wineskin has to be new, or when you try to fit the new faith of Jesus in, it will fail, and your old system will fail too. So we get to where we're at now. While he was saying this, while he was talking about the wineskins, while he was saying this, a synagogue leader came and knelt before him and said, my daughter has just died. And I want to pause here for just a second and say, when I was working on this all week, I felt good about it. And then when the news came with Jerry's son passing, I was uncomfortable just putting this text out here. So I just want to recognize, I mean any insensitivity. We talked about, should we pause for today and do a different sermon? I changed the title of the sermon because I don't want anyone to feel this. There's an awkwardness in the air for me, at least, just talking about somebody whose daughter has died when someone who dear to us as son has. But we felt like we should continue on. So while he was saying this, Jesus, the first thing to point out here is a synagogue leader now. We've had so many different excluded people, so many different people you would think would not have anything to do with Jesus. A synagogue leader is opposed to Jesus. But the synagogue leader is now saying, my daughter has passed away. I have one hope. I have one chance. I got to get rid of that old religion And we'll come back to that here in a minute. But I want to look at something, and this next 4 minutes is going to feel a little bit more like Sunday school than sermon maybe. My daughter has just died is what the synagogue leader says in Matthew 9:19. Mark and Luke tell this same story, and they will tell the same secondary story. The bleeding woman will be in back to back in all three Gospels. Matthew's telling it and says, came and knelt and said, my daughter has just died. I want to show you in Mark, very similar, but more text. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus, we get his name, came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, my little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so she will be healed and live. And if you're listening and watching at all closely, these are different. Matthew is saying, my daughter died. Mark is saying, my daughter's dying. These are different. It's a contradiction. And what I want to do is address very quickly, there are contradictions in Scripture that produce questions. If you're reading synoptically, like I'm going to read through Matthew, Mark, and Luke at the same time, and you go, well, that's different. If this is God-inspired, how would it be different? Did the daughter die or not yet? And it's a fair question. We are interrupted in this sequence, maybe even as we're thinking, because the story continues on, and we'll get back to that. Just then, a woman who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak. She's thinking, if I can just touch his cloak, the bleeding I've been having for 12 years will go away. She did touch his cloak, and Jesus turned and saw her and said, take heart, daughter, your faith has healed you. And the woman was healed at that moment. Mark says this, she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she has freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized power had gone out from him. He turned and asked the crowd, who touched my clothes? The story's different again. Here, she touches his cloak. It says she was immediately healed, and then he turns and he turns to her and says, your faith has healed you, and the woman was healed at that moment when Jesus speaks. In the Mark one and in the Luke one, she's healed the second she touches his cloak. Immediately her bleeding stopped when she touched his cloak. Down here, your faith has healed you, and then she was healed. Why the difference? Why is it that in Matthew, you have one rendition of two stories that are different? Because Matthew says, this happens first. My daughter's dead. Matthew says, the girl is healed after Jesus turns. Mark says it differently. Luke says the same as Mark. Matthew's intention of what he's writing is different than Mark's, and very different than Luke's. Luke is a researcher who's trying to lay out the chronological order and the specific things that are taking place for you to simply watch as though you're watching a movie. That's what Luke's trying to do. He didn't have movies, so don't take it too far. But he's trying to have you read along and go, this is, if I was walking with Jesus, this is what I would have seen and heard and experienced. Mark, different. Matthew, very different. What Matthew is doing is he's pulling out pieces of experience to point to a couple of very specific teachings. New wine and old wineskins. Matthew is putting together a thesis that ultimately says, if you don't change everything, don't bother changing anything. If you don't give everything to Christ, don't give anything to Christ. That's what he's trying to get you to say. He's trying to get you to see through a series of events, this is what they were experiencing and how they were responding to Jesus. So when this story starts to be unfold in Matthew, Matthew's not super interested in chronology as much as accuracy of effect. So while he was saying this, a synagogue leader came and knelt before him and said, "My daughter has just died, but come and put your hand on her and she will live." The daughter had just died is what matters. When Jesus gets to the house, the daughter has died. This in Mark, Matthew doesn't even say. While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus. Some of Jairus' servants come and they say, the synagogue leader to the synagogue leader's house servants say, "Your daughter is dead." So the synagogue leader has come once and said, "Jesus, my daughter's dying. Can you please come?" And he says yes and gets up to go. And then this bleeding woman shows up. And Jesus stops and listens. Then during the midst of that woman's story, some house people from Jairus' house come and say, "It's too late. She already passed." That's where Matthew picks up the story. Matthew leaves all of this out because it doesn't matter for his story at all. The only thing that matters for Matthew is that Jairus, the synagogue leader, and he doesn't even name him, just the synagogue leader, has a dead daughter, and he's seeking Jesus, the most disliked of people in Capernaum, for the people around the synagogue. This guy was unsafe. But Jairus knew, "It's my one chance." Matthew is saying, this synagogue guy starts off with stuff that doesn't matter to us. The interlude story. He came, he said, "Jesus, I need your help." Jesus is going to start coming. The woman shows up, starts talking to him, and then the daughter dies. The only thing that matters for us, for Matthew, my daughter has just died. And so he still says to Jesus, "Come, and you put your hands on her and she will live." Mark and Luke start the story earlier. Matthew starts it at the one thing that matters for this story: the daughter's dead. Please come. So Jesus gets up and went with him, and so did his disciples. Jesus and the disciples go, "There's a dead person." And they still want Jesus to come. They still want Jesus to come because they have faith that Jesus can do something. Jesus and the disciples get up to go, but they're interrupted. There are times in my life where I don't like to be interrupted. Those times are always. But there are some times where I like it less. I'm trying to get the single most important thing in my world done, and some woman that I don't even know, who shouldn't ever touch Jesus, interrupts him. So not only am I focused on something else, I've got something I want done. And I've got my answer going with me, almost against odds. And this bleeding woman who is very much not clean, she's biblically unclean and she's physically unclean, sneaks up on Jesus and just touches him. Now, I'd be okay with that if I didn't ever know it happened. And that's what she was hoping for. But then Jesus stops. That's when I would get a hold of Jesus. "Hey, Jesus, let me list this here. She's not clean. She shouldn't have touched you. You shouldn't touch her. And my daughter's dead. Let it go." This woman who's been subject to bleeding for 12 years has interrupted my flow. Jesus was on his way, and the crowds almost crushed him. So what Matthew hasn't even put in here is that there's a massive crowd around. Next to being interrupted, I don't like crowds. I don't like to be around lots of people pressing in on me, going different directions, wanting different things. And yet Matthew doesn't put this in. We know this because of Mark and Luke, that there's this huge crowd of jostling people trying to get to Jesus, trying to see miracles, trying to just have a glimpse of this guy who's causing all this trouble. They're pressing in, and this woman has weaseled her way in and touched him. And Matthew's going to tell us, Jesus turned and saw her and said, "Take heart, your faith has healed you." Matthew crunches it down into just this statement. Mark and Luke tell us, Jesus turned around and goes, "Who touched me?" You know this. The woman, fearing and trembling and aware of what happened, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. That phrase, the whole truth, is her entire history. Matthew doesn't tell us this. He doesn't tell us that this woman, in the midst of a crowd, comes up, touches Jesus, and Jesus stops. He's supposed to get somewhere and says, "Who touched me?" And even the disciples are like, "Really? There's 1 million people around. You were touched by 42 people in the last 6 seconds. What are you asking that for?" Matthew doesn't tell us any of that because it's not what he wants us to learn. We'll learn it later in Mark. We'll learn it later in Luke. But what Matthew wants us to see is, even though this story happened and slowed him down, Jesus probably spent an hour and a half listening to this woman tell about all these different doctors and all the money she wasted, and Matthew doesn't tell us any of it. Why? Because it doesn't matter for his story. So then what is the thing that matters? When Jesus entered the synagogue's house and saw the noisy crowd and the people playing pipes, he said, "Go away, the girl's not dead but asleep." Matthew jumps to this, the end of the story, because he doesn't want us to get hung up on what took place with the woman. We'll come back in a minute to why that woman's there. After the crowd had been put outside, he went in, took up the girl by the hand, and she got up. You ever watch a movie that builds and builds and builds, and then it just sort of slips away? Michael Crichton. If you've ever read a Michael Crichton book, he was epic for this. Huge buildup. There's a plague that's wiping out all of humanity. There's dinosaurs that are eating up all kinds of people. The end. Jesus just raised a dead girl from the dead. He went in, took the girl by the hand, she got up. News spread. There's no fanfare, no angels, no lights. Grabbed her by the hand, she's got up. Why? Why wouldn't you? This is your sales pitch. Jesus raised a girl from the dead. Matthew almost doesn't care. When you ask in the Bible, in the Gospels, does Jesus ever raise anybody from the dead? If we were not talking about this right now, you'd go, "Yeah, absolutely, Lazarus. Jesus raised my boy Lazarus from the dead. Let me tell you all about that. He was in the grave for 3 days, smelled like an old skunk, came out." Because that story is about Jesus raising from the dead. This story is about a synagogue leader and a woman that don't care about anything except getting to Jesus. This story is about wineskin change. No synagogue leader in his right mind would go to Jesus until he realizes, I got nowhere else to go. No woman that's been bleeding for 12 years and gone to every doctor and spent all of her money would do this thing. Invade a place where she could have been stoned for doing what she did. But she knows that's my only choice. That's what Matthew's telling these stories for. The leper, if we go back a chapter, the leper is in the same spot as the bleeding woman. This is my last chance. I have a disease that can't be cured. This is my last chance. I'm going to go to Jesus, even though he could have me stoned also. The centurion, the guard that guards against the Jews. I've got a servant that needs healed, and you're the only chance I've got. The paralytic can't even get there. His 4 friends, there's too big a crowd. We can't get you in to see Jesus. I got an idea. Let's tear a hole in the roof. And remember, Matthew didn't even tell us that part of that story. We got to learn that part of that story somewhere else, because what he is wanting us to get is every one of these unlikely people are going, I've got to get a new wineskin. So the synagogue leader, no business at all coming around Jesus for this. We're trying to get Jesus out of town. A bleeding woman who has really given up hope until she hears about this guy who can heal sicknesses. And we won't get there today, but 2 blind men is the next section in Matthew. And you know what it says about the 2 blind men? It says 2 blind men followed Jesus. You know, ever try following somebody with your eyes shut? But they were so determined to get to Jesus that one chance that they had, we're going to follow him around until we can get in front of him, because we know he can heal us. Now, why do I tell you all this? We get used to things. We get used to having our phone, so even though when it's stolen, it's like, oh, I got to call my wife. I'll poke this thing and think it's somehow going to work, when I know absolutely it's impossible it's going to work. I just get used to having a phone. And a leper gets used to having leprosy. And a centurion gets used to not wanting anything to do with the Jews. And a paralytic gets used to the idea, I can't even get to a guy that could heal me if I wanted to. A synagogue leader gets used to the idea that that Jesus guy is not somebody we want to be around. A bleeding woman gets used to bleeding, and we get used to things. Jesus said, I came that you might have life and have it abundantly. A fairly famous poet said, men live lives of quiet desperation. We do. What he meant by that was we keep our sickness inside. We keep our things that are wrong inside. When Betty shared a little bit ago, a word from the Lord, it's okay to mourn. We get this idea that somebody dies and it's still like, oh, that's mourning is a private thing. Nonsense. Crying doesn't have to be private. Grief doesn't have to be private. But we get these ideas that this is how it should be done, or this is how it is done, so much so that God's got to interrupt us and say, you were designed to mourn and grieve. You should mourn and grieve. What I had to do with my phone is get a new wineskin. I had to get a different phone. I couldn't fix the old one. I couldn't go find the old one. I could have sat around and whined about the old one, complain and gripe that there's unsafe people out there that steal a phone, blah, 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 blah. Or I could get a new one. For a phone, it's easy. For us in life, we live without the expectation of better life. We live with our pains. Now, some you have to have. I'll be 61 in a week and a half, Lord willing. My knee is rickety a little. If I got to pick something up, I got to be careful that I don't. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about a stiff back and having to wear eyeglasses. I'm talking about those things that Jesus said don't have to be that way. I don't have to be a judgmental person, but I am. I got to get a new wineskin. I can't just go, I got to say a couple more positive things now and then. I don't have to be an angry person, but I am. And it won't help for me to just learn how to smile when I'm mad. I don't have to have a bad relationship with my wife, but I do. These are not personal confessions, just so you know. I have a great relationship with my wife, but my knees hurt. We allow death to stay in our lives instead of going to the one place that can fix it, Jesus. Now, don't get me wrong. If you have an anger problem and you say, Jesus, I don't want to have an anger problem, please take it away, probably isn't going to. Probably not. You're not going to cause your eyes to see change because he wants you to learn as you go. He wants you to learn how to grow, but he'll go with you. You see, he went with the synagogue leader to the house. And why Matthew doesn't make a big fanfare out of it is he's actually not that interested in the healing. He's interested in the journey. He's interested in the absolute commitment to let go of all other pretense. Other synagogue leaders are going to look at that synagogue leader and go, I don't think you can even keep this job. You went with Jesus? The hemorrhaging woman. What kind of madness is that? No medical professional's been able to help me, and I'm just going to go touch some guy's cloak. But she had heard what was true. Jesus can change you. For you and me, what the wineskins are trying to get us to see is we have to recognize we've got an old one that doesn't work. And then ask Jesus, get me into a new one. I need a fitting. I need a new something to deal with this. So I'm going to tell you, and if this is heresy to you, we'll talk about what heresy actually is. Most of us need counseling from wise counselors. That doesn't mean just go out and find somebody and lay a nickel down the table and say, hey, tell me what's wrong. And they'll say, tell me about your mother. That's probably the problem. That's not what I'm talking about. We need to, and there are very good professional counselors, but there's also very good lay counselors, Christian people who have walked the journey. And your starting place is going, this piece of me is death. And I'm going to take it through Jesus to the tools he gave us, the community. We are designed to live in community. And it's community that will help. The community of Christ. I've talked with counselors in my life, some secular, some Christian, about different things. Does it make me miraculously better? No. But it helps me on the journey. As long as I stay Christ-centered and Christ-focused, I recognize this old wineskin is not working. Now, do you know what that is in Christian language? Confession. I have this old wineskin. It gets mad every time somebody cuts me off on the road. I have this old wineskin. I'm critical of my wife when she does things. I have this old wineskin. I fight with my son. I have this old wineskin. Confession is to identify the old wineskin. And prayer is the step into the new wineskin. And he'll then show you where to go. Jesus in Matthew is on this journey with all these people who have made the decision, I want a new wineskin. That wineskin's going to be Jesus. I got to get rid of the old one. I got to get rid of the old one and trust him to provide me the new one. I changed the title of the sermon to I must get to him, go get him. I must go get him. That sermon title is an hour and 20 minutes old because the previous one didn't work because of today's circumstances. But I like this one. Every one of these people said, I must go get Jesus to get rid of my old wineskin. No one can pour new wine into old wineskins. It spills out and it ruins the old wineskin and the new wine. When I'm going through Matthew, I don't want to go to other books very often, but this verse, what I felt like we needed today. It says, I tell you, now is the time of God's favor, and now is the day of salvation. I believe that every person on that list at some point said, today's the day I've got to take this to Jesus. And the sermon makes it all the way to here from 2,000 years ago and the journey that Jesus and all his friends went on, for us to say, I have this old wineskin. We have hundreds. But this one's what's on my mind right now. This one's hurting me. This one's hurting people I love. This one's hurting my growth with Christ. This one's hurting my witness. This one's hurting. And I got to get rid of it. So I'm simply going to ask you to ask yourself, which wineskin do you have that needs to be gotten rid of? Confess it. Hey, God, I got to get rid of this. Tell him why you got to get rid of it. It's hurting. And when you're doing that, if you realize that it's hurting someone, you may need to go to them and say, this has been hurting you and I'm aware of it. I want to get a new wineskin. And I'm seeking Jesus to do it. And if it's a deep, lifelong problem, you probably need to get some help. There's nothing at all wrong with that. Get some help. But if it's something you can just wrestle through with Jesus but if 2 months from now, it's like, I just keep pulling out that old wineskin, then go get some help. Don't accept death. In your life or in your relationships, don't accept it. Because Jesus said, I came that you would have life abundantly. Go to him for it. Get rid of the wineskins that aren't working. Jesus, thanks for today. Aware that this is a very hard day for some, and it's a day you made. We're grateful for the days you give us. We want them to be fruitful and productive and meaningful, full of life and full of joy, and our old skins get in the way. Help us be honest. Help us have courage. Help us seek help. In Jesus' name, amen.